said wisdom in the Bible? And honestly, why do we even care? I'm going to unpack it for you in today's show. Well, hey friend, last week we unpacked the difference between wisdom and knowledge and why it's so incredibly important to understand this as a Christian. Now, in today's show, we're going to wrap up this two-part series, this wisdom series, as we unpack some stories in the Bible that talk about and display these men and women who have displayed godly wisdom and what we can learn from them. Now, my name is Tammy from the website Footprints of Inspiration and a Faithful God podcast, where I teach women how to let go of all that need for perfection in their faith walk so they can show up and create a deep and meaningful relationship with God. Now, as we talked about last week, Proverbs chapter 9, verse 10 teaches us the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Now, I'm not going to get into what the fear of the Lord means. I have an entire video for you that talks all about what fear of the Lord really means. I'm going to put that on the screen up here. I will also put it for you in the show notes below. So whether you are watching on YouTube and just want to dive into that later, or you're listening on your favorite podcast player, you can also click over there. So I won't unpack that. But the fear of the Lord, and really everything begins with wisdom. Another time I talk about this is in the video, 7 Effective Prayers for Spiritual Growth. And the number one thing that we can ask for God, and we're going to get into this more in today's video, but the number one thing that we should ever ask for, the most important thing we should ever ask for, is godly wisdom to process that knowledge that we are given all throughout the day. Now, before we unpack those 3 biblical stories of wisdom in the Bible, we first need to talk about the 2 types of wisdom that are described in the Bible. Number 1 is earthly wisdom. And in James chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, it teaches us, "But if you have bitter jealousy, envy, and contention, rivalry, selfish ambition in your hearts, do not pride yourselves on it and thus be in defiance of and false to the truth." This superficial wisdom is not such as comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, animal, even devilish, demonical. So in other words, earthly wisdom is selfish. It is me-centered, right? It is me-centered and not God-centered. But heavenly wisdom is pure. And we learn this just a couple of verses down in James chapter 3, verse 17, where it says, "But the wisdom from above is first of all pure, undefiled. Then it is peace-loving, courteous, considerate, gentle. It is willing to yield to reason, full of compassion and good fruits. It is wholehearted and straightforward, impartial and unfeigned, free from doubts, wavering, and insincerity." Heavenly wisdom comes from above. It is God-focused. It is not me-focused. It is not self-centeredness, but God-centeredness. Now, this distinction between the two is so incredibly important because it teaches us the attributes of godly wisdom in our own lives. It also challenges us to seek the kingdom of God in all of our decisions. But here's what I really need you to understand here. This is really important. So if you're multitasking, come back to me for just a moment. Godly wisdom is only effective when you put it into action. Did you catch that, my friend? Godly wisdom is only effective if you put it into action. In fact, in James chapter 1, verse 22, it teaches us, "But be doers of the word, obey the message, and not merely listeners to it, betraying yourselves into deception, by reasoning contrary to the truth." We have to be doers of the word if we want to experience growth and transformation in our lives. And I know that you do because you are here right now listening to this. If you want to experience those things, we've got to be doers of the word. We can't just listen to the word. We can't just listen to scripture, hear those Bible stories, and expect everything to change for us. We've got to pursue godly wisdom every single day. So now let's dig into 3 different stories of godly wisdom in the Bible and what we can learn from them. This is really important. Again, we're going to put this into practice. We're not just going to understand that we've got to learn godly wisdom. We're going to see how to apply this into our lives. How? By digging into these stories. But I want you to make sure you stick with me to the end, because as only our amazing God does, I actually have a big and beautiful testimony of something that happened in my life this week. At the time that I'm recording this, something that happened in my life where we had to seek godly wisdom. And it's such a beautiful testimony. So I'm going to share that with you. Make sure you stay to the end. Now, we cannot talk about wisdom in the Bible without talking about King Solomon, one of the wisest men ever to live. Now, here's what I love about his story. Here he was, this young man, and God comes to him and says, Solomon, what do you want? Tell me what you want. I will give you your heart's desire. Now, I don't know about you, but I certainly, at that age, the age King Solomon was at, this certainly wouldn't have been my first choice. This is not what I would have asked for, right? But King Solomon did not ask for riches. He didn't ask for his, the death of his enemies. No, here's what he says in 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 7 through 9. Now, O my Lord, you have made me king instead of my father David, but I am like a child who doesn't know his way around. And here I am in the midst of your own chosen people, a nation so great and numerous, they cannot be counted. So give me an understanding heart so that I can govern your people well and know the difference between right and wrong. For who by himself is able to govern this great people of yours? Solomon didn't ask, Lord, give me more money. He didn't say, Lord, give me more things. He says, Lord, give me wisdom to govern your people, right? I talk about this in episode number 98. I will put a link in the show notes for that. But one of the most important things that we can ever ask of God is wisdom. Just like we talked about last week. We don't need more knowledge, although that knowledge is going to be thrown at us all day, every day. What we need is godly discernment, biblical wisdom to process that knowledge, to learn how to make the right choices, how to walk this out in a way and walk out our lives in a way that honors God. Now, what we see in the passage below this, when Solomon asks, Lord, give me wisdom, right? Teach me how to govern your people. God is so pleased by this. And let's see what his response is in verses 10 through 14. It says the Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for wisdom. So God replied, because you have asked for wisdom in governing my people with justice and have not asked for a long life or wealth or the death of your enemies, I will give you what you asked for. I will give you a wise and understanding heart, such as no one else has had or ever will. I will also give you what you did not ask for, riches and fame. No other king in all the world will be compared to you for the rest of your life. And if you follow me and obey my decrees and my commands as your father David did, I will give you a long life. This is what happens when we ask for wisdom to process everything. God says, if you need wisdom, ask. This pleases him. He doesn't expect us to go through life on our own. He doesn't want us to go through life on our own. We live in a culture right now that says, hey girl, you got it. You can do it on your own. Find strength in yourself. No, that is not what God ever intended for us. He wants us to seek him for the godly wisdom, for the wisdom to go through life. Now, I want to make this very clear here. This isn't about just making good decisions. Wisdom is about so much more than that, and we're going to learn that in these next two examples as well. But I want to dig into a specific example in the Bible where King Solomon displayed great wisdom. And by the way, I have an entire blog post where I am diving into this even further, and I'm sharing 6 other men and women in the Bible who displayed godly wisdom. So I'll tell you how to hop on over and read the rest of that, or read that blog post, because like I said, I'm going into it a lot deeper, and I even share more examples of men and women in the Bible who displayed great wisdom. So let's dive into one particular story. I have a lot more for you on the blog, as I just mentioned, but let's dive into one particular story with King Solomon, when two women, like shortly after all this happens with God, two women come to Solomon and they're very distraught, very, very upset. Both women had just had a baby. One of them, they went to bed one night. One of them woke up and their baby had passed away. And so what this woman did is she swapped her baby for this other woman's baby, right? So this other woman wakes up in the morning and she sees that her baby is dead. And then when she looks a little bit harder, she realizes that's not her baby at all, that her baby had been switched. As you can imagine, very high stress, very emotional situation. And they come to King Solomon and they're very upset about it. One woman saying, no, I didn't do this. One woman saying, yes, this is what she did and this is my baby. So what King Solomon does, and I want you to go in when you get an opportunity and read this, but what King Solomon does is he calls someone in and he says, listen, take this sword and cut this baby in half. Now, to read that at first, gosh, what a terrible story, right? You're thinking, oh my gosh, how could anybody, say this, cut a child in half? But you see, King Solomon was very wise with this. He was very wise with this because immediately the mom, the true mother of this child, says, no, don't do this. Do not cut my baby, do not cut my baby in half. Let her take that baby, right? That selfless love of a mother. And that's why King Solomon did this. He was saying, look, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. We're going to find out who the true mother is. And in verse 16, this is what it says. The woman whose son was alive was deeply moved out of love for her son and said to the king, please, my lord, give her the living baby. Don't kill him. But the other said, neither I nor you shall save him. Cut him in two. So immediately King Solomon knew exactly who the mother was. You see, he used that biblical wisdom that God had given him to make this very difficult decision in a very high stress, high emotional time. So what do we learn from King Solomon? That trusting in God, going to God, asking for that wisdom, and trusting in him brings that clarity, direction, and guidance that we need. Now, there are two other things that I want you to really understand from this story. Solomon didn't ask God to do this stuff on his own. He didn't ask God to do it for him. Instead, he allowed God to work through him. So we should never ask God to do for us what he wants to do through us. Did you catch that? We should never ask God to do for us what he wants to do through us. And here's something else that I really want you to understand about Solomon's story. He's, again, the wisest man. There are so many things that we can learn from King Solomon, but he made plenty of mistakes, my friend. This isn't about, godly wisdom is not about perfection. It's not about doing everything right. It's not about checking off all the boxes. It's about trusting God and allowing him to do the work in and through us. Now let's talk about the wisdom from Joseph. Before I do, I want to remind you, I'm going to share with you my own testimony of biblical wisdom that happened just this week in a very, very, very high stress situation. So make sure you stay around to the end. But Joseph, boy, did Joseph lead a difficult life. And let's be honest, in the very beginning, when he was young, he was very self-assured. This man had a lot of confidence in himself. Why? Because his father, he knew he was his father's favorites. And there was so much contention there because of just that kind of pride that he had, but that pride that he had, that it wound up leading his brothers to be jealous and bitter, and wound up, betraying their own brother and selling him into slavery. He was also exposed to sexual temptation, punished for doing the right thing. He endured a long imprisonment, in his life, and he was forgotten by those he had helped. But despite the betrayal, the slavery, and the false imprisonment, Joseph relied on God's guidance to get him through. One such example can be found in Genesis chapter 41, when Joseph was called to interpret Pharaoh's dream. Now, nobody else could interpret Pharaoh's dream. He was so afraid. And what I love about Joseph's story is he was such a humble man. And this is what he says in verse 16. "It is beyond my power to do this," Joseph replied, "but God can tell you what it means and set you at ease. In other words, so Joseph was allowing God, not having God do it for Pharaoh, but Joseph allowed God to work through him, right? To work through him to interpret this dream, for Pharaoh. So the cool thing is Pharaoh then recognized, because Joseph allowed God to work through him, Pharaoh recognized God's work inside, that biblical wisdom that came from God inside Joseph, and wound up giving him a promotion, like brought him up to the second in command. So what does Joseph teach us in this particular scenario? God's wisdom equips us to navigate our trials and challenges and find purpose in those challenges. That's a big one, my friend. What matters aren't the events or the circumstances, like when we're talking about Joseph and his brothers, it's how we handle those situations, those circumstances. It's how we respond to those circumstances. And trusting in God's plan can turn our darkest moments. Some of Joseph's darkest moments were turned around, and they were turned into opportunities for growth, blessings, and abundance, my friend. Joseph gives us a powerful example of what happens when we seek godly wisdom in our lives. So before we get into the third example, make sure you stick around, because right after this, I'm going to share with you 3 ways that you can seek godly wisdom in your own life. Now, this third example is Abigail. Abigail is someone I don't think we've ever talked about on the show, and I absolutely loved studying her story as I was preparing for this episode and preparing for the blog post. But here's Abigail, married to a man named Nabal. Nabal was not a very good man, and when King David was coming towards, or near the town where Nabal and his family were, he had sent someone ahead and said, listen, can you ask for, food and shelter and stuff as I come into here? Will you go to this man and ask that he provide this for me as I, come into this town? And Nabal stands up and just, no, basically tells him, no, I'm not, why should I provide money for you, or food for you? Why should I do these things for you, right? So it goes back to David, and of course David is furious about this, but Abigail learns what her husband had done to Nabal, and she was a God-fearing woman. She loved God. She knew who David was, knew that he was a man of God, and so obviously, as a wise woman, she saw that what Nabal did had just put a curse on her family. And so what she does is she quickly comes together and puts stuff together so that she can go out and intercede on Nabal's behalf with David, so that she could go out and plead her husband's case. Now, this was a really big insult to David, so this was a big deal. And in 1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 28, this is what Abigail says to David when she goes out to meet him. She says, "Please forgive me if I have offended you in any way. The Lord will surely reward you with a lasting dynasty, for you are fighting the Lord's battles, and you have not done wrong throughout your entire life." Now, her discernment, her humility, and her quick action not only saved her household. That was huge. It saved her household, but here's what the other thing did. The other thing that happened. It also kept David from lashing out, from reacting, on his anger and frustration at what Nabal had done to him. And did you catch that? It's not about never getting angry or frustrated by our circumstances, just as David showed he too got angry. But it's about allowing and showing how we respond in those circumstances. So again, Abigail not only saved her family, her household, but she also kept David from doing something he shouldn't have done. He was set out to do and doing something he shouldn't have done. She trusted God rather than reacting impulsively. She chose to honor him through her actions. Now, her life reminds us that godly wisdom isn't just about making good choices. It's about discernment, humility, and grace, and what it can bring and how it can bring peace, prevent harm, and align us with God's will. So she teaches us that when we seek godly wisdom, it can bring us peace in the midst of that, Again, I'm going to show you that myself in just a little bit with that testimony, but it's also going to prevent harm. And here's what we know in James chapter 3, verse 17. The wisdom from above is peace, loving, considerate, full of mercy and good fruit. When we seek godly wisdom, it's peace loving. It bears good fruit, which is what Abigail demonstrated. Abigail saw the big picture and left plenty of room for God to get involved. She left room. She took control of what she needed to and left room for God to help her through this. She looked beyond her circumstances to see what she could do to promote peace in her life and the life of her family. And she also teaches us that we don't need a prestigious title to make a difference in God's plan, in the world around us. So between Joseph, Abigail, and Solomon, they all teach us how they leaned on God for understanding through it all. They looked above their circumstances, turned their eyes toward God, and allowed Him to do the work through them. They each made a decision to seek godly wisdom that brought justice, provision, and peace in their lives. So let's take some time to unpack 3 things you can do to seek godly wisdom every day. Number 1, you make that ask. You knew I was going to say that, didn't you? We pray, we go to God and we make that ask. James chapter 1 verse 5 teaches us, if you need wisdom, ask our generous God and He will give it to you. He will not rebuke you for asking. He wants to provide wisdom for us. He wants to give us the direction, the clarity, and the guidance that we need to navigate life. So all we have to do is make that ask. Now listen, I do not want you to get hung up on this. Don't get hung up on the fact that it needs to be perfect. It needs to be eloquent words, or you need to pray in a specific space, or this one of these Pinterest worthy spaces. No, that's not it at all. You can even simply say something just as simple as, Lord, give me the wisdom and discernment to handle all the information thrown at me today. That's it. See how simple that is? It doesn't have to be hard. Don't make it hard. Let go of that need for those perfect words and just ask. That's all He's looking for. Number 2, you've got to get into God's word. Why? Because this is where we find these stories in the Bible that teach us how not to just be listeners of the word, but actually doers of the word. How to take the words in the Bible, uncover the character of God and God's promises, and see how to handle just the everything that life throws at us on any given day. So number 2, again, is get into the word. Now, again, I want you to keep in mind, your time with God doesn't have to look a certain way, nor does it have to look the same every single day. Jump on YouTube, have someone, pull up one of those where someone is just reading verses to you. Pull up the Glorify app, my absolute favorite way to connect with God while I'm on the go. Pull up that Glorify app. You can read it, certainly the lessons, but you can also listen to it, which is what I do every day. And number 3, you've got to learn to trust in God's timing and guidance. Now, I want you to remember, this is something I talked about in a previous episode, and I'm going to put the links for it. We did an entire series on what faith in God really looks like. I'll put that in the links below. But we talk about in that series that faith is not the opposite of doubt. Trusting God isn't about going to Him and never having any doubt, never having any fears. It's about taking that doubt and that fear to the Lord, right? And in that series, we talk about the young father who brought his son to Jesus and said, Lord, if you can, please heal my child. And Jesus says, what do you mean if I can? If you believe, I can. And the father, he doesn't walk away from Jesus because he had doubts. Instead, he said, Lord, I believe, but help me to believe more. He says, let me just say that again. Faith in God, trusting God's guidance and timing doesn't mean you never have doubt. It's taking that doubt to the Lord and saying, Lord, I believe, but help me to believe more. So let me just recap those 3 things for you. Number 1, make that ask. Go to God, make that ask. Number two, you've got to get in the Word and uncover these stories in the Bible. Now, I am helping you out in this over on the blog. I'm sharing with you 9 men and women, to include these 3, but we're going to go deeper in that blog post, or I go deeper in that blog post with even these 3, but teaching you the different stories in the Bible about godly wisdom and what we can learn from them. So you've got to do those things. If you want to hop on over to the blog, I highly encourage you to do. It's footprintsofinspiration.com/156. That's footprintsofinspiration.com/156. So I promised to share a testimony with you, and I'm going to make it as quick as possible, but I just want you to see what God does and all that he provides, when we seek godly wisdom. So this week, my sister has been in the hospital, very big scare. And, as we were leaving, and there were some things that went on at the hospital that shouldn't have gone on. There were things that, where a couple of doctors weren't cooperating, or they weren't it wasn't that they weren't cooperating, it's that they weren't assuming responsibility for her care right there in the hospital. We had a couple doctors going back and forth. No, it's not me, that kind of thing. So as I'm leaving, we're a very, very scary time. And it was, without going into too many details, it was just, it was very frightening. There was a lot going on that was extremely frightening. And so when I left for the hospital one morning, it was in a moment of distress, because I got called back to the hospital because things weren't looking good. And again, all of the frustrations and the angers between these 2 doctors. So as I leave the house, I'm livid, I'm scared out of my mind, and I was ready to come, just to be complete, full transparency here, and to show you that, hey, I live out this stuff too, that this isn't easy, and I don't walk it out perfectly either. But as I was heading to the hospital, it takes me about 45 minutes to get up there. I was heading to the hospital, and I was mad. I was livid, and I was ready to go storming into that hospital, and I was going to knock some heads. I was not in a good spot. Obviously, again, I was scared. I was frightened about what was going to happen, how, where this was going to go with my sister, but then also just the frustration of what we were dealing with. And so as I'm driving up there, mad, angry, thinking of all the things I'm going to say as I bust up in that hospital, and God convicts me right then and there. Right then and there, he convicts me and reminds me that I need to seek him. And so I stopped. I took a deep breath. I set my mind on God, and I asked him to give me the wisdom that I needed to handle this situation. I asked that he give me the patience, that he teach me and tell me what questions we need to be asking the doctors, and how to advocate for my sister in a way that honored him, how to advocate in a way that didn't go in there the way I wanted to go in there, with just busting up through those hospital doors, screaming and yelling and demanding answers. I asked God to show me the way to handle this, and in a way that honored him, and in a way that was going to get things done and things handled for my sister. And he showed up in so many ways, my friend. Now, before I share with you what those ways were, I want you to understand something. Because I spend time praying all the time, on a regular basis with God, because I spend time praying, because I spend time seeking God for godly wisdom, right? And by the way, this took me years and years and years. This took a lot of practice. But because I do this in times when things are going well, and I say, and I make that ask to God, Lord, do whatever it takes. Like right now, my word for the year, which we talk about in another podcast episode, I will put a link for it in the show notes below. But right now, my word for the year, my focus for this year, 2025, is righteous. So because I spend time asking God ahead of time, Lord, when I'm not walking in righteousness, or when I'm not walking in a way that aligns with your will for me, do whatever it takes to get my attention. Now, that's a bold prayer, but I ask God those very things. And I ask God that on a regular basis so that in those stressful times, in those times when I can't think straight, when I am so afraid, when I am so angry that I can't think straight, then I know that God's going to show up and convict me. And that's exactly what he did that day. So by asking him, by listening to what he said, by taking a breath, asking him for the wisdom that I needed to process all of this that's going on, to process all this knowledge, like we talked about in last week's episode, to process and know the right questions to ask for my sister and what to do, the proper way to advocate for her, God showed up, number one, and gave me peace. I walked into that hospital room and into the hospital feeling calmer, a lot more at peace. Now, I didn't back down. I was still very bold and confident, but I had that confidence in God that God would guide and lead me. And so as I stepped up to advocate for my sister, I want to be very clear about something. I'm not saying look at me and look at all the things I'm doing. I'm saying look at God and look what God provided because I sought his wisdom. That's very important. So I was able to go and advocate for my sister confidently, boldly, and with more grace, a whole lot more grace than I would have done in my own strength, right? Here's the other thing that God provided in the midst of it. And it all goes back to, it reminds me so much of King Solomon, right? King Solomon asks for wisdom, and God was so pleased by that not only did he give him wisdom, he gave him riches and a long life, right? He gave him all the things he could ever desire. And see, that's the same thing that happens with God. When we ask for those things, he is so pleased by that. He's going to provide everything we need. And that's what he did for us in helping me advocate for my sister. But the other thing is if you've been following me for any length of time, you know I'm a chronic illness warrior. I get migraines, and sleep is if I don't get enough sleep, that really is tough on me. And let me tell you, over this last week, I haven't gotten a lot of sleep at all. But I feel great. And that's something I've been marveling at and thanking God, praising God for, because not only did he show me how to step up and advocate for my sister, not only did he show me what we need to do and how to do it, but he's also provided for me and protected my health in the midst of it. Any other time, I would have been flat on my butt. You know, when you have a migraine, you'll get through the hard, stressful times. A headache won't. If you've got a headache, you're going to have a headache whether you're in stressful times or not. But with a migraine, your body will get you through what you need to get through, and then your body shuts down. And I thought for sure yesterday when I came home that my body was going to shut down, and it didn't. And in fact, today I woke up and I feel great. I was so excited to get to work. So excited, may I say, that my sister, God has shown up so big. I know this isn't always the case, but in this particular case, my sister's doing so much better. I give God all the glory for that. All the, just our time in the hospital and leading us to and getting us doctors who would respond and take responsibility for her care and there. So it was really good. And I just want to share that testimony with you. Again, not to say, oh, look at Tammy and what Tammy did. No, but to say, look what happens when we seek God. And look what happens when we're seeking him on a regular basis and asking him to convict us in those stressful situations, in those times that we can't even think for ourselves, our automatic reactions, we start to react to situations without seeking godly wisdom, because that happens. That happens. Stressful times come and it happens. But because I'm seeking him throughout the rest of my life and the rest of, or what am I trying to say? Because I'm seeking him on a regular basis. That's what I'm trying to say. God shows up and convicts me when I need him. And he's going to do the same for you, my friend. So I want to hear from you. If you are watching on YouTube, I want you to drop a comment below and tell me which of these three characters in the Bible, Solomon, Joseph, or Abigail, which of these three do you resonate with most? What you have going on in your life right now, which one do you resonate most with when it comes to seeking godly wisdom? I want to hear from you. Drop that in the comments below. Listen, I know this takes a lot of faith. So what I'm going to do is at the very end of this video, if you're watching on YouTube, otherwise I will, and by the way, if you're watching on YouTube and or listening to on your favorite podcast player, I'll put a link in the show notes below, but I've got an entire 4-part series on faith, what faith in God really means and how to walk that out. So I'm going to put that for you in the video here and again in the comments below. And listen, my friend, you've got this. You've got to seek godly wisdom. It's one of the most important things we can ever ask for when it comes, when it comes to our prayer request. That is more important than any other thing we ask for. And remember, I've got a blog post for you with 9 examples of wisdom, godly wisdom, of men and women who sought godly wisdom, in the Bible. Now, remember, I do break down these 3, but I even go deeper than I did in the video today. But hop on over, go to footprintsofinspiration.com/156, learn about those other characters in the Bible, because I promise you, my friend, that whatever you have going on in your life, you're going to resonate with one of those characters. You're going to be able to see and really gain some insight into how to seek godly wisdom through these examples, these incredible examples in the Bible. So again, footprintsofinspiration.com/156. And then, my friend, I will meet you back here in the next episode of A Faithful God Podcast.